Great afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MHHS webinar on the Change Control overview. The agenda that we're going to run through today is an introduction and scope of the MHHS Change Control, the Change Control approach and process, roles and responsibilities, SLAs, response times, and key documents to be aware of, and then we'll close out with a Q&A. Just to say, a reminder to please send in your questions using Slido with the hashtag MHHS. We'll address questions at the end of this webinar, and this webinar will be recorded and the slide deck linked as well on the Collaboration Basin website when we complete. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Lewis, the introduction.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caitlin. Good afternoon, all. So for those that don't know me, I'm the PMO lead here on the MHHS programme. So I've got a general responsibility within that for kind of all governance and secretariat activities, planning, RAID, and change control as well as a few other items. So today we're going to talk to you a little bit about change control. I think we've made a couple of enhancements to the process that we wanted to call out and just hopefully provide a bit more visibility and clarity around how the process works. And then the roles and responsibilities within it, so that being kind of the change board, the advisory groups, and then the individuals as well. So Caitlin, if we just move on to the next slide. So the change control process itself has been operational since around about March 2022. In recent months, we've seen the volume of change increase with kind of the baseline of design. And we've seen some feedback from industry, which we've looked to incorporate, as I mentioned, into how we can improve visibility of change and provide greater clarity around roles and responsibilities. And as I mentioned, fundamentally, the PMO itself managed the entire change control procedure from start to finish. So if you do have any questions, either in this Q&A or afterwards, please don't hesitate to either get in touch with me directly or a member of the PMO team by dropping an email to the PMO mailbox. The process itself is designed to manage the execution of change on the programme in a controlled manner, managing that risk with delivery, and to ensure that everybody in the process feels responsible for executing said change to deliver the programme in the most successful way. There's kind of three main ways that we're aiming to do this and what we're looking at doing over the course of the next kind of 3 to 6 months. And that is kind of briefing you all here today and in the future, if need be, to ensure that people are kind of clear on the process and that we're kind of continuously providing updates to it and allowing people to contribute into and provide feedback. Ensuring that change becomes a bit more of a standing agenda at governance meetings, as I mentioned, that as we move towards testing and as perhaps change takes a bit more of the forefront, we need to make sure it's represented appropriately at the governance groups. So where appropriate, we'll be looking to introduce that, and we already have a slide or a dashboard in the PSG deck that kind of covers the latest position on change requests, and all of that information is also available in the collaboration base. And in briefing key governance forums, so typically the advisory groups and those decision makers on their roles and responsibilities, so everyone's briefed and clear on what is required from them. Key thing to note, there is a single change control process for MHHS. There are a number of kind of clear decision points within that process that I suppose dictate how long things may take, what routes changes may go down. So typically they are either an expedited change, which is in an instance where perhaps the implementation of a change or the decision timelines needed are shorter than the standard process SLAs, which we'll touch on a little bit later. In that case, we can look to expedite the change. There's an escalated change, so should a change exceed the thresholds that are set out in Ofgem's governance framework, which Imi will touch on a little bit later on, that change can be escalated to Ofgem as the programme sponsor. And there's also managing the housekeeping change, which is typically minor updates to documentation that don't then require an impact assessment, but the changes do need to be captured for kind of auditing purposes and full traceability. So the recent kind of enhancements we've made to this process as an example of that, have a housekeeping change, which is captured under CR26. Caitlin, if we could just move on to the next slide then, please. So I guess without teaching people to suck eggs too much, there are effectively three sources of change that could require a change request to be raised. A change to one of those key success factors you see on the screen, time, cost, quality, or scope. A change to a baseline program artifact, and also kind of a change raised via the design issues process, typically following kind of a DIN that may manifest into a change through the design review group or the DRG. A key guiding principle to the process is that a change can be raised by any participant on the program. And as I mentioned earlier, the process itself covers from when that change is identified to when it's either then kind of rejected or implemented based on the decision making kind of throughout the process. And I think I'm going to then hand over to Imi, who's just going to talk a little bit more around what a change should and shouldn't have.
Thanks, Lewis. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Imi. I'm in the PMO team as well, and I am responsible for managing change requests that come into the MHHS programme. So in response to some feedback that we have received from various participants, we've set out some guidelines on what change requests should and shouldn't include, and also steps that they need to go through before they are submitted. So first of all, change requests should be discussed at either working group and or advisory group levels before being submitted to the PMO. There's a section within the change request form where the change raiser can confirm or state to the group that the change has been discussed with. This helps to expedite the process, as it means that the appropriate programme stakeholders are already understanding what is being proposed to change. The change request should only include one option within it to be impact assessed, so the change should be a single solution. We do recognise that a number of changes have come through the programme in the past, which have included multiple options, and these have led to some confusion and delays in decision making and implementation. So as a result of this, going forward, if a change contains optionality or requires further solution analysis, this will be undertaken via the programme participant information request process. This will lead to a change request giving a single solution to be impact assessed by industry. Any change request that hasn't been discussed at an appropriate governance group or that includes multiple options will be returned to a change raiser to ensure these steps are completed. I think that's back over to you, Lewis.
Brilliant, thank you, Imi. Yeah, so if we could just move on to the next slide, we'll jump into a little bit about the process. So I'll talk at a high level around the full process, and there is a very detailed and comprehensive process map that sits behind this, which is available on the collaboration base and also on the website. Fundamentally, though, the change process has four key phases: kind of identification, the initial analysis and assessment, full impact assessment, and then kind of decision and implementation. So within the identification stage, the process starts when a change is submitted to the PMO by the change raiser. As I mentioned, that could be anyone, either a representative of the programme or a programme participant. And at this stage, to do that, the change request form should be filled out and then submitted to the PMO mailbox. The PMO will confirm receipt of the CR and circulate this to the change board, attendees, and other key programme SMEs as and when required. Moving then into the initial analysis phase, the change board typically sits on a fortnightly basis, but this can be increased as and when required. So, for example, if there is an expedited change, an ad hoc change board can be convened. The change board will typically ask the change raiser to attend and present their change to that group as well. And typically, the change raiser may then be questioned in that meeting around the solution viability put forwards in the change, the desired implementation timelines, and whether, as Imi mentioned, the change itself has been reviewed at either working group or advisory group level. The change board would typically then either approve the CR or suggest feedback to ensure it's as clear as possible for when the impact assessment is undertaken. And in the rare case, a change can also be rejected by the change board. If approved, the change board will also assign an advisory group. So if it's a design related CR, it will make its way to DAG. If it's perhaps in testing or code world, it will make its way to either TMAG or CCAG. If it's related to program timelines, it will typically make its way to PSG if there's an impact on tier 1, tier 2 or tier 1 milestones, for example. And the advisory group, then their job is to essentially validate the change request from a subject matter expertise perspective, and either then typically reject or approve or feedback on the change to ensure it is ready to go out for impact assessment. Once the advisory group makes their decision, they'll communicate that to the PMO, typically through the chair and the secretariat who supports that group, and the impact assessment will then be issued out by the PMO. Once that request is sent out, it will typically have a 10-day lead time for impact assessment, and then IAs, as many of you will know on this call who've completed them, are then returned to the PMO mailbox within that 10-day lead time. The PMO will collate all of these into a consolidated report, pulling out kind of key metrics against approvals, rejections, or abstentions, as well as kind of the qualitative information as well, which will aid decision making at the appropriate advisory group, where that report is then submitted as part of the papers. So moving then into kind of the decision making and implementation phase, the SRO and the chair of the advisory group that owns the change will typically look for consensus decision or consensus approval from the representatives of that meeting, but the SRO fundamentally does make that final decision. And at this stage of the process, we've now introduced, based on some feedback that we've received, we will now introduce a proposed implementation timeline for the advisory group to agree upon. So the advisory group will get the view of the feedback from industry on the change, and also should the change then be approved, they will also get a proposed implementation plan. So that might be an indicative date by which the change should be implemented by, and then how this is kind of built into the subsequent releases, so on and so forth. If approved by the SRO and the chair of the advisory group, then this will make its way, this will be communicated to industry along with that plan for implementation. And then the expectation is that impacted parties will then incorporate that change into their individual work plans to be delivered by the time set out in the CR and in the implementation plan released by the programme. A quick note on how the fast track design update process works in line with the change control process, as this was some feedback that we've had as well. So fundamentally, DINs addressed through the fast track process are wrapped up into interim releases, and these are issued on a monthly basis. So we've seen interim release 1 and release 2 go out, interim release 3 scheduled for early August. These are typically obviously enhancements and clarifications to the design rather than fundamental changes, and they don't then need a change request. Where a DIN is particularly complex, it may be taken to the DRG, and then output of that session could be that a CR is then needed, and at that point a CR would then be raised and go through the impact assessment process, or the full change process as I've just talked about here. It's also worth noting that there could be a further options analysis exercise needed to be undertaken after that DRG, and that would be done via the PPIR process that Imi referenced earlier. And then once a single solution is then agreed upon, a CR would then be raised. Caitlin, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So I won't touch on this too much, but one of the bits of feedback we've had is around providing greater clarity on the implementation process. So we've built this process map, and this for this meeting particularly, and also this has been captured into the detailed process map as well. So it hopefully provides that clarity and talks to the process around implementation of CRs that I just kind of alluded to. So as I mentioned, essentially once a consolidated IA report or the summary report is created, the program itself will develop a proposed implementation plan for the change based on an approval decision being made. This will then be presented to the advisory group alongside the the findings of the impact assessment. And then once approved, it will be formally communicated and built into the program plan and the subsequent release schedule within the program. If we move on to the next slide. So similarly to the implementation approach, one of the bits of feedback we had was how horizon scanning and the management of external change dovetails into the change control process. So we've looked at that and revised that slightly as well and mapped that out in this slide here. So this is the horizon scanning log, for those that perhaps aren't aware, is something that's managed through the CCAG. And this is the process by where external industry change is captured by the code bodies and raised into the horizon scanning log. And that then needs to be assessed by the program to ensure that the impact of that industry change is understood by the program, and any changes or any actions that need to be taken by the program are done so in a timely manner to ensure that there is no disruption or issues caused. So as I mentioned, it starts with the code bodies raising the potential change into the log. The PMO, in this case myself and IMI, and will regularly review that log for updates. And then once those updates come in, we review those with the appropriate program SMEs across design, migration, testing, code, so on and so forth. The impact will then be captured and the log is then updated, and that log is reviewed on a monthly basis through the CCAG meeting. If further action is needed, then this action will be recorded and taken, and that might be as much as members of the design team attending regular code body forums to keep an eye on the change. It could lead to a fundamental update to design documentation or testing approach, whatever it may be. But that action is captured and executed in a timely manner to ensure no disruption on the program. This process, as I mentioned, is facilitated and kind of managed by the PMO, and that's linking kind of the work that IMI does, as well as the governance and secretariat function, who manage the CCAG and CDWG and the code work streams. So hopefully that was helpful. That was a bit of a canter through the process end to end. Like I said, there is much more detail available in the change control approach documentation, as well as the detailed process map, all available on the website and all available on the collaboration base. And I'm repeating probably what Caitlin's going to come back and close on. So I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Chris Welby, who is going to talk, I think, a little bit more about roles and responsibilities.
Thank you, Lewis. So obviously the change process sits within the programme under the programme steering group, and the change board reports to the programme steering group, but works very closely with the relevant advisory groups. So if we move to the next slide. So there are effectively four parties involved within any change. There's the change raiser, there's the change board, there's the advisory group, and there is obviously programme participants themselves. So if you just take you through the roles and responsibilities. So the change board receives a request and just checks, as Amy has set out, that it meets the criteria, that it's been discussed elsewhere. It ensures that the change request is clearly articulated, and by this I mean that it sets out a clear issue that needs to be resolved, and it sets out a clear single solution. So we don't want change requests to kind of don't articulate what the problem is fully, and we don't want one to articulate the problem but then come out with several different variants as to what we need is change requests to actually state what that change is needed to resolve the issue that it's identified. The change board will also review the severity and the urgency of the proposed change and understand the implications. So we would have to look at whether it has a significant impact on programme timelines. We will also look as to whether the proposal will cross the Ofgem threshold, as where Ofgem would be the decision maker on the CR rather than PSG or the advisory groups. And we would then, once we've satisfied ourselves as change board, and I should make this point at the moment that the change board is an internal board, but we do invite the change raiser to attend the relevant change board to present their change. we will assign it to the appropriate advisory group. So the change board does not make any decision on the change itself other than it to proceed into the process. It would allocate to an advisory group. That advisory group may be the PSG if that's required, and it will pass it to the advisory group, and then we will monitor the progress to make sure that it matches the SLAs and processes going forward, and obviously keep an eye on conflicting change requests and things like that. When the change board passes it over to the advisory group, then obviously the advisory group will look at the change request and agree that it's suitable to go out to impact assessment. They will discuss it, and if the change raiser agrees, then they may make amendment to the change request to enhance it in some way, and that includes whether the implementation date or the actual change itself can be enhanced. Usually, the change raiser will be invited to attend the relevant advisory group, or they can pass that on to a nominated change owner, which is usually the relevant advisory group constituency rep for the person raising it. So if it puts it out to impact assessment, then it will come back and the results of the impact assessment will be discussed by the advisory group, and then the advisory group will advise the SRO or the chair in this advisory group to which way they would like the change request to be accepted, approved, rejected. It's worth pointing out at this point that the advisory group can, if it wishes to, pass down the change to a working group, whether an existing working group, or create a working group distinctly for the change if it feels it needs a bit more work, although that should have happened in the pre-stage before the change request is submitted. So the more likely course of action is that the working group has worked out what that change needs to be before it becomes a change request. If the change is approved by the advisory group, then the SRO will ensure that it passes through. We will pass it back to the PMO. If we reject the change, then the advisory group chair must provide the rationale to support their decision, which will do so. Can you have the next slide, please? Just to create the roles of the change raiser. So the change raiser is identified responsible is the person who is responsible for drafting and submitting the CR. So the program doesn't draft on their behalf unless the program itself is raising the change. The change raiser typically be a program participant. It may be the program, or it may be, in exceptional cases, Ofgem as the sponsor. The change raiser will raise a CR, engage with PMO as required. Once raised, the change raiser then either keeps ownership but can pass ownership of the change to another person, usually the constituency rep for the relevant advisory group. Although it doesn't have to be, it's up to the change raiser. If it's particularly technical, they may wish to pass it on, assign a change owner to somebody with who can understand the more technical details of it. Program participants is this final one. Program participants are obviously to engage in the change control process through the advisory groups, but more importantly is to respond to the impact assessments, because it's only at that point that we can fully understand the consequences of the change that's been raised across all participants. So it's very important, even if there is no impact, and to know that there's no impact is useful to us as a program, and it's useful to the advisory group in making the decision, or advising the SRO on making the decision. So that is very important that we do get as much impact assessment back as possible. I think that's all I've got to say. So pass back to whoever it is I'm passing back to.
I think it's me up next. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, this is me. Thank you. So to ensure that we have efficiency and timeliness in the change control process, we have laid out some SLAs for both the programme and participants to adhere to. There is quite an extensive list of SLAs, and the complete list can be found in the change control approach document on the MHHS website. but just want to call out some key ones in this session. So firstly, the acknowledgement of the submission of a new change request. This will be actioned by the PMO within 1 working day. So it's mentioned earlier on, new change requests should be submitted to the PMO mailbox, and we will acknowledge that that's been received within a day. The next step is the change board reviewing a change request. This will happen within 10 working days of the submission of a change request. And then once a change request reaches the point of going out for impact assessment, it will typically go out for 10 working days. There is some flexibility in these timelines. So for example, a change raiser can request for a change to be expedited if the implementation or the decision is urgently needed. This would typically reduce the impact assessment window to 5 working days. In the same breath, an impact assessment window can be extended if participants require more time to respond. For example, we gave an extended response period for the replan change request as it was a more significant change in its volume. The change board are ultimately the decision makers on whether we can expedite or extend a response period, and any of these changes in response periods will be clearly communicated to all participants. Lewis mentioned this before, I think Chris did as well, just going to go into a bit more detail about off-gem approval. So there are some change requests that will require off-gem approval, and in doing so, this may add additional time to the decision-making process. So we do need to go to off-gem for approval for any change which would either cause a level 1 or tier 1 milestone to be moved by more than 3 months, a material or fundamental change to the target operating model, a cost of over £5 million for a singular change, or creating a significant impact on market stability or consumers. And then just the next slide, please, Caitlin. We also have a full suite of supporting documents which can be found on the MHHS website and the collaboration base. So the key document here is the change control approach, and this is the overarching document which explains everything in the change control process. It references everything that we've covered today and provides further detail on all of these topics as well. The detailed change request process map mentioned by Lewis earlier is a detailed process map and articulates the full end-to-end change control process from the raising of the request to the implementation. The change request form should be used by participants who wish to raise a change request. We need all areas of the form to be completed before being submitted to PMO, and it does come alongside the change request guidance form, which explains every area and kind of every bit that needs to be filled out. If there are any questions or concerns about filling out a form, the PMO will happily take questions on that as well. And then finally, we have the change request log or dashboard. This is just a live dashboard that's updated on an almost daily basis. And this covers all change requests in the MHHS programme, giving their current status in the change control process. And this is on the collaboration base. Everything mentioned here is also linked on this slide, and the slides will be shared after the session. That is everything from me. I believe I'm handing back to Caitlin. Thank you so much.
That's right. Thanks, Imi, Lewis and Chris for presenting today. Just to run through the communication and support routes that participants should use to get in touch with the programme regarding change control. So as Imi has already laid out, we've got the change control approach document, which is on the website and the collaboration base. And we've linked it here in this deck in a couple of places for you to take a look at. We've also made reference to the relevant slides where some of the process maps or other information shared in this deck can be found in more detail in that approach document. Of course, we have the usual website collaboration base and our weekly newsletter, The Clock, which goes out every Wednesday, which provides you additional information on the programme, as well as any impact assessments, any change control related news that you may need to know about. And then finally, our PPC bilaterals, which we encourage you to take advantage of, opportunity to speak with your PPC rep on a monthly basis, where you can ask questions and raise any kind of queries you'd like through that channel. So without further ado, we've had quite a number of questions come in, which is great. Thank you all for your engagement. And during the Q&A, if you'd like to issue more questions with the Slido, please do. We will be sharing this deck the recording of this webinar and also a Q&A document to accompany it. So any questions that we don't get to today, we will address through that written format and inform you through the collaboration basin website accordingly. So first off, we had a question regarding how will the change control process adapt when the programme is in sit? There may or will be changes as opposed to defects which will need quick progression.
Cool, yeah, I can pick that one up. So typically we will, if we need to expedite the change, as I mentioned, we will look to do that. We are aware that obviously when we get into sit, we will need to turn things around at a quicker time. So the process itself won't change, but it may be that some of the SLAs are shortened, and we look at ensuring that we can meet the required timeline. So that's where the expedition route would come down, and we would communicate any changes to SLAs to industry as that process takes place.
Thanks, Lewis. We've got another question about how a potential change gets to be discussed at a working group, but that may have been covered through sort of the phases that you discussed earlier. I don't know if you want to give a high-level reminder of that.
I can do that. So obviously we assign a change to the advisory group. It's up to the advisory group as to whether they wish to pass it down to a working group or not to discuss it. So that is really a gift of the advisory group to whether they pass it to the relevant working group. If they do, then the advisory group will probably pass it to the working group with a please respond by. So hopefully that is where it would come through. That it's also possible. It's worth pointing out the advisory group may ask another advisory group for input as well. So while we assign it to an advisory group, they are the lead advisory group on the change. It is possible that they may also seek input from other advisory groups as well.
Thank you, Chris. This may be one for the design team and potentially take offline, but there was a question, is there any criteria for which DINs would require a CR?
I think, yeah, it's one to clarify completely with the design team, but what I can say is that each DIN is reviewed in isolation, and those that are deemed to be, complex in nature are then typically taken to the DRG for further discussion and evolution. So that would be the route by which those particularly like I said, complex or challenging DINs that need further exploration would be dealt with. They would go down that DRG route where the solution options or the next steps would be discussed and agreed with that group fundamentally. And that itself may then lead to either wider industry consultation on the options analysis, or it could lead to a change request being raised on that solution to address the DIN itself.
Thanks, Lewis. We've got another question on the design fast track review process as well, so we'll take that offline and address it in the Q&A. A couple of questions that have come through regarding rationale, communicating the rationale and reasons for why changes are rejected or accepted, and is there an appeals process?
Okay, I'll take that. So most cases, the rationale for acceptance is that the group has the relevant advisory group has reached consensus in their advice to the SRO, and the SRO accepts that advice. So if we don't tend to communicate that, other than the fact that it was agreed, consensus isn't necessarily unanimous, but it is usually that the vast majority of parties are of the constituency representatives are in favour. If the SRO makes a decision which isn't reach consensus, then the SRO will set out the reason for their decision to the relevant advisory group, and they obviously then for the constituency reps to pass it down to their constituencies as to why that decision was made. As for the appeal process, if this is made at an advisory group, then there is a route where a programme participant can challenge the decision by taking it to the PSG for the SRO to consider, for PSG to consider, and for the SRO to make a decision whether to uphold or overturn the decision. Programme parties can also, if that is unsuccessful, they can appeal to the IPA about the decision, but they must present their evidence as to why, and it's why they are dissatisfied with the decision. So going to appealing it on the grounds that you didn't like the decision is probably not going to get you far. So you would have to make the case as to why you feel that the decision was wrong. But obviously we would consider what we're very conscious of, what we don't want these people just come in making an appeal and then just reiterating what they reiterated at the meeting, that why they don't like the decision. But yes, there is an appeal process there.
Thank you, Chris. We may have covered this around the implementation pieces of the phase of CRs, but there's one question here that is there any input on the implementation timeline by participants or advisory groups?
I'll take that, yes. So the advisory group will discuss the implementation date. The SRO will make a decision on the implementation date. But just for everybody's benefit, we are now looking at implementation dates, and we are considering when which milestone change need to be in before. So as we go through the milestones, so it might be that a change is required, but it's not required until we start M14. It might not even be required until later, which means it might be after migration, which does get into a question then as the variables of who's making the decision. But ultimately, we will make this. So the change requester, so the change raiser, will obviously make a case as to why they think a particular implementation date is required. But it's for the advisory group to test and challenge that.
Yeah, I would just add that on the change request form as well, there are a series of kind of classifications that the change raisers can fill out to suggest when they think the change should be implemented by, and that is kind of one of the questions asked at the change board. And the way that the response to the impact assessment is filled out, we ask for impact on schedule, time, cost, resources, provides program participants an opportunity to provide feedback on the impact on their schedules, on their plans as well. So that is all then taken into account in the decision making and then the implementation approach.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge there's a question here regarding the outlook on the wider code body changes, but that feels like that may be something we need to do a deeper dive with the code team rather than addressing here. Would you agree?
I can take it to share as CCAG. So we cover so we have regular horizon scanning of all the changes that are happening across the various code bodies. Come to CCAG to inform us about this. There is a horizon scanning log. I believe that's on the collaboration database, so people can see it. But what we would do with the program is get those information from the relevant code bodies, assess it and see whether it has any impact. Then we will monitor those that either do have an impact or have the potential to have an impact. And obviously, where necessary, we will feed into the code body decision-making process. So we will respond to consultation, attend working groups as required if we believe it has an impact, primarily to make sure that either we can mitigate any risks it creates to the program, or in fact that just make sure that we work together and ensure that they don't contradict each other.
Thank you, Chris. I think we've got time for one more question, which is, who is on the change board?
I can pick that up, and then Chris, if you want to jump in if I miss anyone.
No, you manage the governance, so you can pick that one up.
So the PMO facilitated change board, so it's made up of myself as the PMO lead. Imi is the secretariat, so we facilitate it. Chris Welby, he is the chair of the change board. There's then representation from program leadership, workstream leads, and also the IPA are on there as well. So where required, based on the nature of the change, we may invite kind of particular SMEs from the program in to offer an opinion. But generally it is, program leadership, Chris as the chair, myself and Imi from the PMO facilitating, and then representation from the IPA. and of course the change raiser.
Super. All right, well, we'll sign it off there. As I said, we will be sharing the Q&A document to ensure that we've addressed it all, that we'll share on the collaboration base and website, and we'll publicize that through the clock as well, so you'll be able to see that come up in the newsletter. We'll also share the recording and this slide deck as well. Thank you everybody for your time today, and have a great rest of your Thursday.